As a man, much of your power comes from your dark side, the parts of the psyche that are not nice or convenient. Especially for men, much of your competence, your sexuality, your magnetism, your ambition, your authenticity, even your creative ideas come from this part of the unconscious. They are essentially the source of your inner fire. And when this part of you is integrated, you have access to all of these virtues, conscious access. And when it's dissociated or not integrated or suppressed, it either leaves you impotent, or it comes out in some unconscious, harmful, or self-sabotaging way, or many times both. A lot of my active behaviors had to do with suppressing aggression or anger. Maybe it had to do with early childhood conditioning, but I do remember, even as a more conscious adult, conscious in quotes, I had this idea that anger was not something I wanted to ever feel. Like I even would say to myself and sometimes other people, anger's not a productive emotion. Like I had this idea, this kind of moral framework that I wanted to be enlightened. And therefore, anytime I felt any kind of upset at a person or a thing or frustration, I would stuff it down. I would try to not feel it. As Brene Brown says, you can't selectively numb. So when you numb out certain feelings, you're also numbing out basically all of your feelings. And if you know parts of my story, in this time, my early 20s, that I developed psychogenic ED, it's like I had numbed out my emotions so bad that my body actually became numbed out. And there's a lot of like feelings and emotions that I was numbing out at this time, but anger was a big one. Not only was I physically impotent at this time, I was also emotionally and creatively impotent. I had a hard time being authentic with people because I was essentially hiding part of my personality all the time in order to be liked, which of course didn't help me actually be liked. I could be nice to people, but I couldn't really connect deeply. And even when it came to my creative projects, I would have a hard time really accessing my ideas. Like I wanted to be a creative person. I felt like a creative person. I would have initial ideas and get really enthusiastic about something. But as I would work on it, I would kind of lose the feeling. Like it would kind of like, it's like I would start with this spark and then would get extinguished before I could really build it into something or make something useful or express myself, because again, creativity comes from feelings and I was numbing out my feelings. So even though I was trying to be this enlightened being, I was still a human, and I was still a man. There's plenty of people and things that would piss me off. There's plenty of things I was frustrated about in life, but I would stuff it down. Looking back with hindsight, I could see how even though I was suppressing this aspect of my personality, this dark side within me, I was still drawn to these things. And it was coming out kind of in these unconscious ways where all the entertainment I was interested in had to do with violence. Right? Like I would watch Sons of Anarchy. I was obsessed with that show. Breaking Bad. I would rewatch Fight Club. I would often have like these fantasies of like stopping a mugging or something and like beating up someone. Like I had all of this like aggression that was bubbling out in my unconscious, but I was stuffing it down and thinking consciously that I was this peaceful, non-aggressive light being. And once in a while it would blow up in my personal life where I would grossly overreact to something. Right? Like I would blow up at a roommate over something small because I had been suppressing so much. And it didn't get this far, but I do believe that if I kept suppressing this part of myself, one, I would have been miserable, right? Because I wasn't really connecting with people. I wasn't expressing myself. I didn't have access to my power or my real sexuality even. But I also think it would have come out in a probably even more harmful way, where I do believe that all the things that people call, in quotes, toxic masculinity is expressed in a way that harms people. I do believe it comes from dissociation from this archetype, dissociation from the dark side, right? Because if a man has this integrated in himself, as we'll discuss in this episode, he can express it in a conscious way that is actually useful. So before we go into action steps, it's important to understand a practical model of your psyche, because many people assume that who we are is just this one unified thing. But of course, that's not the case, right? If we were just one unified being, if our personality was singular, we would never have inner conflict. We would never have, inner resistance. We would never feel like we're fighting ourselves. We would never have internal dilemmas. We would just be this one singular being that does whatever it does, right? But of course, that's not the case. The human experience is full of inner conflict and dilemmas and different parts of ourselves battling at times. And as we know from biology, even the human brain evolved in disparate structures that even have separate goals, your reptilian brain, your limbic system, your neocortex. But for just a conceptual model, we'll break it down into some categories of nature and nurture. So down at the bottom are primal survival instincts that we have in common with all living beings, right? Just things to survive and replicate, correlates with the brainstem. This is just what it means to be an animal. After that, there are aspects to you that are maybe more unique. This is kind of the personality you're born with. And I think Jung's concept of archetypes applies really well here, because essentially, when people speak about archetypes nowadays, it's often from this kind of overly mystical lens. But when Jung started discussing archetypes as applied to psychology in the early 1900s, he basically described archetypes the same way that, Darwin and his predecessors described genes, right? They are patterns of information that pass on generation to generation because they're useful. So just like your eye color comes from a sequence of information in your genes that you got from one of your parents and they got from one of their parents and so on, archetypes are patterns of feelings and behaviors that were passed on from your ancestors because they were useful, usually because they were useful. So for instance, if you have the tendency to rise up to challenges and confront things head on, a behavior that we might call the hero archetype or the warrior archetype, this is in you, this pattern is in you because countless members of your ancestry, specifically your male ancestors, had this behavior pattern in them and it was useful, so it got passed on to you. Most male tendencies and virtues, which I would call the masculine archetype, directly correlate to testosterone. Men have more androgen receptors, which is why we are more interested in competition, more interested in confrontation, maybe more disagreeable. And actually, as a quick sidebar, a few of the students in my masculine archetype challenge have brought up, I think, a pretty good question, which is, what if these so-called masculine traits or virtues are not a part of me? What if I don't actually have a dark side? What if there's not something in me that's suppressed or dormant, but I just don't have it in me, right? I just don't have these dominant traits or these aggressive traits. Like, what if that's just not who I am? And actually, another student in the course gave this response, which I think is great, so I'm repeating it to you guys, which is, first the question, are you attracted to feminine women? Are you attracted to femininity in women? Does femininity draw you in? Does it turn you on? Does it open your heart? If that's the case, if the answer to that is yes, then I hate to break it to you, you are in fact a masculine man. Like, you have these testosterone-driven traits in your psyche. Maybe they were suppressed. If you're not attracted to feminine women, then maybe that's the case. You're just not masculine. But if you are attracted to femininity, then that is the signal that these masculine virtues, these archetypal masculine traits are in fact in you, which of course includes the masculine dark side. So your primal instincts and these archetypal patterns are your nature. This is the parts of your personality you're born with. Everyone has primal instincts. Everyone is born with certain archetypes in them, maybe more potent or more strong than others. Neurotypical males have certain masculine archetypes within them. Neurotypical females have more feminine archetypes. And obviously there's, a wide range of possibilities, but this is your nature, right? This is the personality you are born with. On top of that is the nurture. So your early childhood conditioning, which includes the culture you're born into, how your parents treated you, the belief systems around you, if you experience any traumas at this time in your life. And for our purposes, we can define trauma as some usually painful event that reshaped your personality in some long-lasting way. Most of these things happen in early childhood when your brain is more plastic, but it could happen at any point, right? If you end up in a Chinese prison camp and you get brainwashed, that is, reshaping of your psyche. The last part of the nurture is the conscious part. This is where your conscious ideology comes from, your beliefs about yourself. Like, if you go back to my example, this idea I had that anger is this bad emotion or this non-productive emotion that I don't want to have. Like, these conscious ideas, we can basically put in the category of morality. These are our ideas about ourselves and about how we should behave that we try to measure ourselves against. Anytime someone uses the word should, they are referring to morals. Another term that's often used nowadays in moral arguments is, oh, that is not okay, right? Anytime someone says, oh, such and such is not okay, they're again measuring it against a moral abstract framework. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm not arguing against morality or anything, but what we should understand is that morality is one of the last layers that gets into our personality, or one of our last layers of who we are. Since society, very rightly so, is based on a certain moral framework or cultural framework, a lot of people assume that morality is like the deepest thing. Like, there is an absolute good versus evil. Whereas that's not the case, right? If you look at any internet argument, or if you look at some of the wars that are going on right now and how people argue about who's the good guys and who are the bad guys, you can see it's really not easy to take real life complex events and make a clear good versus evil line. That's just not the case. Now, morality is really important, right? For society to develop, we needed moral frameworks. Like, one of the best morals ever created was thou shalt not kill. Obviously, a society where people think it's good or okay to kill each other is not going to do as well as a society where they say killing is not good. But of course, we could think of many instances in real life where maybe it is okay. Like, if an intruder comes in and threatens your family, or, if you eat meat to create food out of, an animal, you do need to take its life, right? There are many instances where killing is maybe not bad. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying you shouldn't have morals, but it's to understand that your morality, whether it's conscious morality or implicit morality, is one of the last aspects that affect your personality. And very often it goes against parts of human nature. There are many aspects of human nature that don't fit in easily to a moral framework, whether it's a complex geopolitical event or even things that go on in your life. So a common example, if someone grows up in a religious household or culture where sexuality is seen as evil or it's heavily shamed, this person might internalize that shame and feel bad every time they feel or think a sexual thought. But that doesn't mean that goes away, right? That sexuality is part of our nature, that desire to procreate or that desire to, connect intimately with whatever you're into as determined by nature. That is a part that's not going to go away. So very often we see this come out either the person feels this incredible shame and like confusion. You often see this with, gay people who grew up in a Christian environment. They have maybe this self-loathing. They try to numb themselves out. And or it comes out in this weird dissociated way where, you see this person basically express their sexuality in some really harmful way, either to themselves or other people. So when we adopt a certain moral that goes against our nature, if it's conscious, we typically feel shame. This is what you see in many very controlling cultures. But if it's like incepted into us young enough, it might actually cause us to dissociate from that part of ourselves completely. And essentially we call this our darkness in quotes because we're trying to take our consciousness away from it, right? If there's some part of ourselves that we feel like is not good, shouldn't be a part of us, we kind of shove it in the dark where we can't see it consciously and focus on, the light and happy parts of our personality. But these parts of us are still there and they find their ways to express themselves. And for instance, most entertainment involves darkness, right? Any kind of drama deals with some sort of darkness. Most kinds of comedy actually deal with dark things that we're not supposed to talk about, but it makes us laugh when the comedian talks about it because there's recognition of like, oh yeah, that thing is true too, even though we try to pretend it's not. It's like many of us have this built up tension where we're trying not to think about a certain thing or talk about a certain thing, but then we hear the comedian talk about it and our unconscious realizes, hey, it's okay to think about this too, and that tension releases in the form of laughter. This is also why women tend to be attracted to this dark side in men or darkness in men, quote, bad boy archetype. Because it's a sign that such a man still has his nature intact, right? And if you compare the tropes of the bad boy versus the nice guy was willing to dissociate or suppress parts of his instincts, parts of his procreative nature in order to be liked or to fit into a moral framework. Whereas the bad boy, he's willing to say no to morality. He's willing to say no to what is convenient or would allow him to be liked because his nature is so strong. And of course, a woman wants to mate with a guy whose nature is still intact. And if you haven't observed this directly, or if you don't believe me, look at any romance novel for women. They always involve a dark side in men. Always. In basically every romance novel, the male love interest has this darkness in him. He's usually disagreeable. He's a powerful guy. He has some traits which are inconvenient to other people. And he usually turns out to be nice because it's a romance novel, but he has this darkness in him. So as we go into the actual action steps on how to integrate, the first thing I would offer you is a question. Are you willing to reconnect to your nature even at the expense of disapproval from other people? Because that's the reason why any person would dissociate from a part of themselves, or why a man would dissociate from his aggression or his sexuality, his dark side, because some external force said directly or implicitly, we don't approve of that. And then it gets internalized and then the person starts to dissociate. Because I would actually put integrating your dark side into essentially 2 steps, which are simple, but they're not easy. So this first step, self-approval, for some actually requires a pre-step, because if you are so dissociated from these parts of yourselves that it doesn't even feel like it's you, or it's like it's so dormant in your personality that it's not obvious. It's not like, oh, I want to express my aggression more. I want to express my boldness more or my sexuality more. But you don't feel any of it. Like for me, if you caught one of my other episodes on dominance, like the idea of being a dominant male, I didn't have any conception of me being dominant. Like I just didn't think I had that in my personality until I started to really introspect and uncover deep and look into the things I'm unconsciously drawn to, and eventually finding this expression and finding that it really was a part of myself that I had just hidden from me. And again, I would look at what are you drawn to as entertainment, or where does your attention tend to go when you're not trying to do anything? What do you daydream about? What kinds of people are you drawn to, right? This is actually one of the lessons in my masculine archetype challenge, to inventory what are all the things that seem to interest you. Like for me, even though I had this suppressed aggression from probably my whole life, I was really into combat sports, like more than any other kid. Like the first time I saw boxing, I was like, wow, I want to do that. Like I want to hit people. I want to get hit. I couldn't explain it because like no one I knew was into boxing, like no parents. I was never really exposed to it. But the few times I saw it, I was like, wow, that's something I want. And as I mentioned later on in life, I was really drawn to aggressive behavior. I think most men are drawn to action movies and war movies because this is an archetypal expression of masculinity. Fighting, competition. And in my years of coaching men, I noticed that when a guy has a certain kind of fantasies he's drawn to, whether it's like the fantasy of being an MMA fighter or like beating up a bad guy, or even like romantic fantasies, like, if you've seen the Joker movie, there's this kind of sad sequence where he has this entire make-believe relationship with his neighbor, even having never spoken to her. It's like he really goes into delusion land, borderline stalking her. But you can see from his perspective, he was just too afraid to actually talk to her. So his unconscious created this whole romance in his head, but really what he was longing for was romantic connection. So when it comes to your dark side, this typically means looking at what makes you feel shame, like what you feel embarrassed about or guilty about thinking about. Essentially, anything that you feel shame about is something that your conscious mind is trying to dissociate from. I work with a lot of guys around shame or darkness when it comes to their sexuality, and very often we'll go through a pretty simple exercise where I allow them to think about or talk about the things that they feel into, the things that, turn their body on, and see if we could talk about it in a way that does not produce the shame. Can we disable that shame? Can you talk about it as if it's okay? Essentially, can you move the stuff that's in the darkness of your psyche into the light where then it's like, okay, well, I think this is okay. Doesn't mean you need to act on every impulse that you feel or every desire, but it's looking at what's in you, looking at your desires, your feelings, and acknowledging it. And I want to stress again that this does not mean that you should do everything you feel like doing, because again, that word should implies a moral framework. It means that you are not cutting yourself off. You're not numbing yourself out. You are allowing all parts of yourself to be conscious and seen and approved of, right? You're approving of yourself and your inner nature, even at the expense of external disapproval. And by putting it into your consciousness, you can choose what to do with it. So essentially, you are replacing all of these internal should statements or moral statements with if-then statements or conditional statements. So instead of saying, I should be faithful, you can say, if I cheat on my girlfriend, then I will likely ruin a really good thing I have going on, this really great relationship. If I punch someone in the face because I'm angry at them, then it might feel good for a second, but it'll cause all of these very negative downstream effects that I don't actually want. Because the second step of integrating your dark side is once you inventory and approve of all of these aspects of who you are, once you basically put all of your nature back into the light, then you can choose how you express it, right? And with many natural impulses, even seemingly dark impulses, there is a way to validate the emotion, to express the feeling behind it in a way that's constructive or actually meets your needs or brings you closer to what you actually want. So for example, with sexuality, if you see an attractive person who you have all of these genuine desires to do physical things with, of course, forcing yourself on the person is not going to actually give you what you want, right? That's not, even for non-moral reasons, that's just not practical. But you can take that feeling, that genuine, authentic feeling, those genuine desires within you, and find some way to express it in a socially acceptable fashion. I did a whole other episode on this, on how to authentically flirt or how to flirt instinctively. Same thing with aggression. Because anger actually is a productive emotion. Gabor Mate says this a lot, where anger is the emotion of getting people out of your space or correcting an injustice, if you want to put it that way. So if something pisses you off, even if you're maybe getting worked up over something that you don't need to, that emotion, that feeling is genuine. It is pointing to something that is not okay between you and your environment. So if something is pissing you off, it is a very clear sign that there is some action that your unconscious wants you to take. In most cases, the best action is not actually being violent, but it is usually confronting something or someone head on. That angry feeling inside you is trying to drive you and fuel you to some action that probably involves or requires a lot of vigor and courage. Because the most important thing is to truly be who you are. Nature gives us all the tools, the patterns, the archetypes, the instincts to accomplish what are natural goals. Now, obviously, modern life, modern culture, modern society has moved very far away from nature. So One of the challenges of a modern human is to figure out how to have our nature be intact and also integrate with our environment in a useful and desirable way. But arguably all personal development is coming back to who you are, like actually being who you are. This part of you that is not considered convenient or nice by society, but it is part of your nature. And when you connect with your true nature, which includes integrating your dark side, you will be more happy and fulfilled. And that comes from approving of all of the stuff that's within you and finding a conscious and desirable expression. Because the only way to really be fulfilled is to be connected to your true inner nature, which must include integrating your dark side. Goodbye.